On the Waterfront, The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. With the title Actor of the Century, barely anyone achieved what Marlon Brando has over his career. Winning 2 Oscars and having a handful of the most important acting performances of all time doesn't do him justice when describing what he brought to the profession. He was the first to bring a natural approach to acting in Hollywood, relying on imagination of the character rather than just memorizing lines and emotions, transforming acting to basically what we know it as today. But this won't be a video about his greatest performances and achievements, or his political activism, or even his controversial personal life. No, instead, it will be about the more troubled side of Marlon Brando that occurred on set. The never reading or memorizing scripts, making weird complicated demands, and butting heads with the cast and crew side of him that often gets brushed under the rug. We'll see co-stars wearing his cue cards, weird costume requests, and many pranks. And although his career has some of the highest of highs, there is a lot of mediocrity in there as well. Looking deeper into those on-set stories and career choices shows a troubled and conflicted actor that didn't have passion, an actor who didn't care. Marlon Brando's career can be split into 4 sections: his rise to fame, his downfall, his resurgence, and his I don't give an F era. With his onset issues progressively getting worse in each section, he became completely unbearable by the end of his career. Definitely stick around to the end because the stories only get more interesting and there's an explanation to most of his behavior. But first, let's fly through his pre-film career to build up the kind of person he was. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1924, as a child, Brando picked up a habit of mimicking and pranking other people. In high school, he failed every subject except sports and drama, was held back for a year due to misbehaving, and was eventually expelled. His father sent him to a military academy where Brando was also expelled for sneaking into town. Although being invited back the year after, Brando decided to officially drop out of high school and followed his 2 sisters to New York to pursue acting. Brando enjoyed acting when he took part in a play in the past and felt accepted when he acted because it was the first time in his life that he heard good things about himself. He studied under Stella Adler, learning the techniques of the Stanislavski system that focuses on the art of experiencing and fully realizing the character you are portraying. It is this system that he brought into Hollywood and resulted in him despising being labeled as a method actor. In 1944, he started acting in theater plays, and he was already difficult to work with. He often displayed insubordinate and erratic behavior, even getting kicked out of a production. But his acting vastly outweighed his issues. He appeared in the 1944 Broadway play I Remember Mama, but could have had a bigger role if he made any attempt at reading his lines at the audition, an early sign of his contempt at memorizing lines. In 1946, he was voted Most Promising Young Actor for his role in Truck Line Cafe. His theater performances were great, but inconsistent because his style of acting made it hard to fully realize the character the same way during every show in a play's tour. Some critics pointed out that it looked like Brando was still building his character but couldn't quite get there. So maybe this style of acting would work better in a different medium. Brando also butted heads with co-star Tallulah Bankhead in The Eagle Has 2 Heads, who hated his behavior and style of acting because she'd never know what he was going to do next. Brando really drove her crazy. Some of his antics included scratching his crotch and picking his nose during live plays. He was eventually dismissed and found a role in the 1947 play A Streetcar Named Desire, his first collaboration with director Elia Kazan, who'd go on to direct a few of Brando's earlier films. His rise to fame in the film industry started in 1950 with his very first role in The Men. He played a bitter paraplegic veteran and even spent a month in bed at a hospital to prepare for it. And to no surprise, the performance was praised. He followed it up with the film adaptation of A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951 that is widely considered one of his best performances, even getting him a Best Actor Oscar nomination. This was the first of his 3 film collaboration with director Elia Kazan, the others being Viva Zapata and On the Waterfront. Viva Zapata released the following year, and in preparation had Brando going to the Mexican town where his character Zapata lived to study the speech patterns, behaviors, and movement of the people there. And yes, his performance was praised again. Brando actually had to defend his lead role from co-star Anthony Quinn by urinating the farthest in a peeing contest. He then starred in these 3 films, winning the Best Actor Oscar for his role in 1954's On the Waterfront, which to this day is known as one of the best performances of all time and includes the iconic "I could have been a contender" scene. Brando actually left the screening room depressed by his performance, thinking he was a huge failure. He remained a box office draw for the following years, but his performances faltered at times. Brando had a contract to do Desiree in 1954, which he put very little effort into because he didn't like the script. A year later, he acted alongside Frank Sinatra in the musical Guys and Dolls, who called Brando the world's most overrated actor and nicknamed him Mumbles, because he was bitter Brando got the lead role even though he's not a singer. Tensions rose between the two of them often. There was one scene where Sinatra's character eats cheesecake, and Brando, knowing Sinatra hated cheesecake, would purposely mess up each take. This early on, and Brando was already a shit disturber. We even saw him continue his childhood love of pranks in The Young Lions, where he convinced everyone that he drowned. After the director yelled cut for a scene, Brando continued to lay face down in the shallow pool of water for over a minute, eventually revealing a massive grin after everyone panicked. And although no individual instances were reported, Brando already started using cue cards instead of memorizing his lines in this part of his career. Marlon Brando's downfall came in the form of two films: One-Eyed Jacks and Mutiny on the Bounty. One-Eyed Jacks was the only film Brando ever directed. He already had the star role, but also ended up taking the director role just 2 weeks before the film was set to start, after Stanley Kubrick stepped down. Brando fired many of the screenwriters, making Kubrick stepping down for unknown reasons questionable. Originally budgeted to cost $2 million, the film's budget inflated to $6 million, mostly due to Brando's style of directing that resembled his style of acting. He spent too much time pursuing perfection. One example of this was when they needed a shot of the Pacific Ocean, and Brando waited 2 hours to get the perfect wave. To no one's surprise, the allotted 3 months of filming turned into 6. The film flopped, and Brando was put on Paramount's hit list. Mutiny on the Bounty tarnished his on-set reputation to the point where the industry feared working with him. Brando deliberately sabotaged every aspect of an already difficult production. He was possibly responsible for a change in directors, used the cast and crew for his own purposes, and if something didn't go his way, he'd stand in front of the camera and not act at all. This reminds me a lot of Klaus Kinski, which we have a full video on. All of these issues with Brando's inflated ego, coupled with the difficulties of shooting in Tahiti, ran the film way over budget. The film flopped at the box office and almost ruined MGM. Hollywood was beginning to have enough of Brando, and the streak of flops that would soon follow only backed up these feelings. Brando began to take on roles just for the money, even signing a 5-film deal with Universal, which was very unlike him. All 5 films were critical and commercial flops, except Ugly American, that was received well enough. Brando later recalled this part of his career as the FU years, but admitted that he was very hurt and emotional about all the negativity towards him by critics. The 60s almost killed his career. Brando wasn't seen as a box office draw anymore, so there was less of a reason to put up with his on-set attitude and antics. But lo and behold, he had a resurgence in the form of 2 films, The Godfather and Last Tango in Paris. Marlon Brando as Vito Corleone in The Godfather is easily one of the most iconic performances in film, but it was a casting that Paramount was very much against. After losing them a lot of money with One-Eyed Jacks, having a streak of box office flops, and a bad reputation on set, the Paramount Pictures president would not let Brando be part of a film for as long as he's in charge. Luckily, he budged, but only if 3 conditions were met. Brando would take a lower fee, he would accept financial responsibility for any delays due to his behavior, and he would submit a screen test. With a lower fee accepted, Brando was on his best behavior during most of filming and was actually very supportive of the cast and crew. Nothing too controversial happened. There's that famous picture of Robert Duvall wearing cue cards for Brando to read during a scene. Although Brando was infamous for not memorizing lines, in the case of The Godfather there were many last-minute script rewrites, so he would almost get a pass here, except that the other actors didn't need any. Brando the prankster also made a return. For a scene where he was carried upstairs, he had the prop people put weights under him that made him harder to lift. There was also a mooning competition that started with James Caan and Duvall, but eventually Brando claimed victory when he mooned over 500 extras when filming the wedding scene. Quite a different production than I would have expected from such a serious film. Brando won the Best Actor Oscar for this role, which he refused to accept due to how American Indians were depicted in Hollywood. He followed it up with another critically acclaimed performance in Last Tango in Paris. The film was very controversial due to certain sex scenes, especially one that involved butter. He received a Best Actor nomination for this and had cue cards posted around the set for easier visibility, which forced director Bernardo Bertolucci to try and keep them out of the frame. With these 2 performances under his belt, both of which did well at the box office, Marlon Brando was back. But so was the ego and the on-set issues, which he took to a whole other level. In 1976's The Missouri Breaks, Brando was unhinged and uncontrollable by director Arthur Penn, who eventually gave up and let Brando do whatever he wanted with his character. He fully improvised it, used an Irish accent for no reason, behaved as a silly British upper-class person, and donned a wardrobe to match it all. Critics weren't pleased with this performance. The Sun stated that Marlon Brando at 52 has the sloppy belly of a 62-year-old, the white hair of a 72-year-old, and the lack of discipline of a precocious 12-year-old. But 1978's Superman is when we might have seen Brando at his laziest. Brando played the part of Superman's father. Jor-el. He was paid $3.7 million plus 11.75% of the film's profits, which amounted to an extra $19 million. That's over $100 million today. And all of this was for only 10 minutes of screen time of the total 143. His name did help at the box office, but Christopher Reeve was only paid $250,000 for playing Superman. Even with the huge payday, Brando was still a pain to work with. Reeve even publicly expressed his disappointment with Brando during a talk show interview where he openly said that Brando phoned it in, and that it's sad how the press doesn't care if Brando has a good or bad performance, so Brando himself stopped caring as well. Director Richard Donner thought his performance was actually great, but that didn't change how difficult it was to get it out of him. Those 10 minutes of screen time only required 12 days of filming with Brando, but it was hard to get him out of his trailer because he'd get paid even more if it went past the planned 12 days. They had to lure him out with food. And once you did get him out, you had to deal with his cue card request that had to be displayed off camera, which was one of the conditions for accepting the role, as well as not having to read the script beforehand. He even had his lines written on the baby's diaper he shared the scene with. And the cherry on top of all of this was that Brando had the idea of doing a voiceover instead, where Jor-el would be a bagel because no one really knows what Kryptonians look like. Luckily, the director was able to stand his ground and control him a little. He was even more difficult in his next film, Apocalypse Now, that had the most notorious film production ever. Severe weather destroying expensive sets, Martin Sheen suffering a heart attack, and then a very overweight Marlon Brando showing up on set. Critics had already taken notice of Brando's fluctuating weight back in the 60s, which only got worse in the 70s and was on full display in Apocalypse Now. Already being quite heavy when he was hired for the role, Brando promised Francis Ford Coppola that he was going to get in shape. It was shocking when he came to set in the state he was in to play the role of Colonel Kurtz, who was supposed to be lean and consumed by the jungle. To help make Brando look a little leaner, he wore all black and many of his scenes were very dark. Brando came for 3 weeks of filming, getting paid $1 million a week, and didn't even bother reading Heart of Darkness, which Coppola requested he do beforehand. Because of this, the two of them spent days exploring the story and the character, putting production on hold. If filming his part took more than 3 weeks, he'd get paid even more, so it made sense that he was often the one urging Coppola to take time to explore the character with him. Although not what was originally intended with the character, I think the final result ended up being pretty iconic. Brando then starred in the critically panned The Formula in 1980, where he used an earpiece to be fed the lines instead of the usual cue cards. It was pretty convenient because his character uses a hearing aid. His performance wasn't too good though, getting his first Razzie nomination for it. Brando then announced his retirement from acting, which only lasted 9 years, returning in 1989 with a dry white season. He was moved by the commitment to social change by the director and took a very low salary for it. Despite not being a fan of how the film was edited, the film was reviewed well and Brando received his last Oscar nomination as a supporting actor. And now we enter Brando's I Don't Give an F era, the real FU years. During this time, he starred in all of these films. He had a great performance in The Freshman where he played a caricature version of Vito Corleone, and he had decent performances in these 2 Johnny Depp films. But he also scooped up a Razzie for The Island of Dr. Moreau, got nominated for 2 others, and really kicked his on-set antics up a notch. These antics were most notable while working with Johnny Depp, while filming The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Score, which was his last feature film and contained the worst of Brando. Johnny Depp said that the hardest part about working with Brando for the film Don Juan DeMarco was keeping a straight face. Brando was in full prankster mode again, and Johnny Depp fully supported it. He even gifted Brando an electronic fart machine, to which Brando exclaimed, "I found God," being a fart joke enthusiast himself. Brando's antics wouldn't be as funny on the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau, but they were quite strange. He continued his new method of using an earpiece instead of cue cards, but occasionally as he was fed lines through it, the earpiece would pick up other frequencies. Co-star David Thewlis said Brando would be in the middle of a scene when all of a sudden he'd receive police messages through the earpiece and he'd repeat, "There's a robbery at Woolworths." Screenwriter Ron Hutchinson said that Brandon feuded and refused to cooperate with the cast and crew. He spent hours in his air-conditioned trailer when he was supposed to be on camera, butted heads with co-star Val Kilmer, and wanted to suspend production for the script to be rewritten with one weird detail. He wanted his character to remove his hat in the final scene, revealing that he's actually a dolphin. But some of Brando's crazy demands did make it to the final cut, like wearing an ice bucket on his head. There are many weird stories attached to this film's production, including the fired director apparently wearing makeup to look like one of the background mutants to keep an eye on the production. This film is known as one of Brando's worst. A better received film, The Score, had Brando acting alongside Robert De Niro and Edward Norton for what would be his final feature film. Brando was a nightmare to work with for this film. especially for the director Frank Oz. Brando would call him Miss Piggy because Oz played Miss Piggy from 1976 to 2001 and refused to take any direction from him at certain times. De Niro had to act as a mediator and direct the scenes with Brando when things got too heated. Brando also reportedly performed many scenes in his underwear because all his scenes were above the waist and it was hot on set. In his character's final scene, Brando refused to smile, forcing them to tweak it a little in post-production with CGI. At least they didn't have to open his eyes. On July 1st, 2004, Marlon Brando died of respiratory failure at a California hospital. He really struggled the last few years of his life with obesity, which gave him many other health problems. The legacy he left behind will be talked about for ages, with his name always coming up when discussing the best actors of all time. But it's hard not to look past all the potential he had to be even greater, if not for his onset issues and career choices. As an actor with such a natural talent for acting, why did he choose to go this route? Well, there are a few reasons why. His reluctance to memorize lines and instead rely on cue cards could be seen as lazy or him not caring. But to Brando, memorizing and reciting lines sounded very unnatural because that's not how people talk. People don't know what they're going to say in advance. Even when they open their mouth to talk, they are still thinking and looking for words to say. These were the natural expressions Brando strived for, pausing to find the right word and thinking about how to compose a sentence. Otherwise, he said it sounded like Mary had a little lamb to his ear. But the reason for many of his on-set antics and acting in many bad films was because he just didn't care. Acting was at one time the only thing he enjoyed when he was young, and quickly lost passion for it. This was especially apparent in the 60s and the 90s, where he had the worst stints of his career. During the 60s, he became very involved in political activism and distracted by his personal life, becoming disillusioned by his career. He didn't see acting as being as serious or important as it once was. Instead, he just saw it as a way to earn him some money. That's why he signed that multi-film deal in the 60s and the stinkers he signed up for in the 90s, where his personal life was even more in shambles. Brando lived a very controversial life outside of acting that would be hard for anyone to separate from their work life. He had many partners and at least 11 children, 2 of which were involved in a very publicized court case that Brando had to plead for reduced sentencing against his son. The 90s were rough on his life, and by this time he didn't care too much about his career. Some say that it was just his career he didn't care for, but still very much enjoyed acting. But how the two were related was something he struggled to figure out himself. He believes some of the best acting he's done was in Burn, which few people came to see. And the amount of emotional arm wrestling he did in Last Tango in Paris made him not want to destroy himself emotionally for a film ever again, when there were much easier options available. People were willing to pay him just for the name alone, or the opportunity to work with him. And as Christopher Reeve said, "It's sad that we didn't care what kind of performance Brando would put in, so Brando stopped caring as well." But let's end off on a more positive note. During promotions for 2001's The Score, a reporter tried to get in contact with Brando for an interview, to which she got back a fax stating, "Marlon Brando is unavailable," signed by Dr. Tim. Dr. Tim was one of the 2 English Mastiffs that stayed at home with Brando, so even till the end, he carried on his childish sense of humor. And that's about everything. Thanks for watching. We really hope you found this video and all of Marlon Brando's on-set problems entertaining. What are some of your favorite Marlon Brando moments? Leave your comments down below. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to check out our Patreon for more content and some cool perks. And until next time, have a good one.